Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Pandas and Prose. We will get started here shortly. Good morning or good evening, wherever you are dialing in from. All right. Well, I know a few folks will join as they're getting their morning coffee or afternoon espresso, but welcome so much. Thank you for joining today's Pandas and Prose. My name is Jenna, and I will be your host for today. Before we officially begin, I just wanted to give a special shout out to our WWF members and heroes on this call. Thank you so much for your ongoing support of WWF, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're so grateful to have you. And now for a few quick logistics. This is a Zoom webinar, which means your participant cameras have been turned off automatically and your microphones are on mute, but you're able to use the chat feature throughout. So please ask your questions and we will get to audience questions at the end of this conversation. And as a reminder, this event is being recorded and posted to YouTube after for those friends and family who weren't able to join us live today. And so our two wonderful guests, we have Becky Chaplin-Kramer, WWF's Global Biodiversity Lead Scientist for WWF, working across the network with external partners to advance science and implementation of conservation strategies to support biodiversity. And Peter Godfrey-Smith is here with us today to talk about his newest book. I have it right here with me, Living on Earth, Forest Corals, Consciousness, and the Making of the World. Peter is also the author of the best-selling Other Minds, The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness, which has been published in more than 20 languages, and Metazoa, Animal Life and the Birth of the Mind. And he is a professor in the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. And, you know, for WWF, this conversation is really timely because we are gearing up to release our 15th edition of our Living Planet Report next week. And this conversation is really a prelude to that. The Living Planet Report, or LPR, is essentially a biennial check on the health of the Earth and highlights the importance of biodiversity in nature. And so through this conversation, you know, we're hoping to get at the heart of the why we as humans should feel compelled to do our part to protect it. And so with that, Becky, I'll turn things over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna. And Peter, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're really excited to have you. Can you start off by telling us where you are in the world and how are you keeping busy?
I'm in the Blue Mountains, which is a range of lowish, by American standards, mountains west of Sydney in Australia. This is where I live. I'm just back from the UK, where I did a tour to promote Living on Earth. And more generally, I've been spending a lot of time in the forests and following birds around recently, less time under the water, and I intend to get back under the water as soon as possible. I won't say goodbye to the birds, but I'll shift the emphasis a little.
Excellent. That sounds wonderful. And, you know, coming fresh off your book tour, we're very excited to have the chance to chat with you, you know, right as the book has been released. But this means that many of our viewers or listeners, audience, probably won't have had the chance to read it yet. So I thought to ground them in some of your vivid storytelling that you use to navigate the complexities of living on Earth and our place in it. I wonder if you could tell us one of those stories. One of my favorite stories from the book is the dolphin and the octopus, two highly intelligent species who are each missing a key innovation that humans have stumbled upon. What are they, and what does that tell us about ourselves?
Okay, yes, that's one of my favorite parts of the book also. This is in the middle, where having gone through part of the history of life, the history of animal action, animal behavior, and having talked about the importance of culture as a feature of human life and human intelligence, I wonder why it was us, why it was primates and not some other kind of animal that achieved the kind of unique role, sort of in some ways a dominating role that we have on Earth. So I compare us with a few different kinds of animals, with the birds, with dolphins and octopuses. And let's talk about the dolphins and the octopuses. Why not them? Why aren't we primates sort of minor players in an octopus-dominated or a dolphin-dominated world? Well, in the case of octopuses, they are far from being able to become cultural animals. They don't have, they're fairly individualistic, not very social, and the whole way they live makes that hard for them. And I think that it's social life, it's the cultural exchange of ideas and skills and habits that was essential to humans acquiring the role that they acquired. Now, dolphins are well set up for that kind of path because they're more social and they do have elements of culture. They have strong connections between parents and offspring, which octopuses don't have. But dolphins have in common with fish bodies that are not much good at manipulating things, at shaping their environments, at transforming and building and so on. And that makes sense in the sea. In the sea, there's a lot less building and constructing, except in cases where you put your body on the line, as with corals. So dolphins lack manipulation, octopuses lack culture. Primates have both of those things.
Yeah. And I loved your allusion to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy of, with the dolphins being the most intelligent species on the planet and just choosing to live that life, the carefree life in the waves. And you took a sort of evolutionary stance of, unfortunately, just because something might be more pleasant doesn't mean that it will win. And so this role that we've come to play of dominant, but also potentially the responsibility of stewards, because we've had those two advances, really struck a chord with me. Another story I really loved was your story about the Blue Mountains, where you are now. Right in the beginning, that opening is just so captivating. And you described with such poetry, you even quoted a poet. I had to go back and read the whole poem by Ted Hughes, which I loved, about how that land was formed. And honestly, I've come from a background of grounded in geology and ecology, and yet it was a different story than the way I usually hear it told, and how I learned about the formation of our own Grand Canyon, for instance. So often as students of natural sciences, we learn about things in progression. First, there's geological, physical forces, chemistry, and then later comes the biology. But you've shown really well how it's all mixed up. And you said, life shapes rivers and rivers shape the land, which is so poetic. I love that. Can you tell us a little more about what you mean by that?
Sure, yes. And the place where I'm sitting right now really exemplifies the power of these unobvious and small causes to do dramatic things. The Blue Mountains have a history that has various stages, and there was some volcanic activity and some role for the more familiar mountain forming forces. But the shapes that we see around us, which in some cases are astoundingly dramatic up here, really are a consequence of the action of water. Charles Darwin, on the voyage of the Beagle in the 1830s, came up here and actually came up quite close to where I'm sitting now and marveled at the landscape. And at a certain point, he thought, it looks almost like a sea coast. It looks almost like the consequence of what water does. But even he, with his keen interest in the role of small causes operating over large time spans, even he didn't think it was literally true that the small rivers that you see going through the Blue Mountains over long periods of time really have shaped the landscape. So rivers shape the mountains. They have given us the contours, the dramatic forms around us. And further, and this is not something that's particular to the Blue Mountains, but it's a general feature of rivers. Rivers were different on Earth before land plants, especially forests, became established. Forest plants with deep roots I don't want to exaggerate, because you can get well-structured rivers in the absence of plants, but apparently before forests appeared on Earth, rivers tended to be sort of sheet-like a lot of the time. They weren't these sort of focused, coursing, meandering structures. And it's those directed, confined rivers that have the dramatic land shaping effect. So as you say, life shapes rivers, rivers shape the land.
That's just so awesome to think about in an evolutionary sense, or in a geologic time period sense, because a lot of our work at WWF is promoting nature-based solutions, ways that our natural world protects us from hazards and, provides other benefits like erosion regulation or water purification. So I have run models that show me exactly what you're talking about, of like having different types of vegetation hold in the soil, prevent it from eroding the whole hillside. And yet never.
Okay, you've done this work. That's exciting.
Yeah, that just, the idea of like the landscapes that I see are not these physical, purely physical forms, but that life has played a role all along, and that's just, I don't know, somehow really full circle for me. Both of those actually, so that actually kind of segues to my next question for you, because that in itself sort of struck me with this sense of awe and wonder, that something I've known to some extent all along, but in a short time frame has played this much longer role over this deep time. And I often have that sense of awe at the natural world. Something that when I go out into nature, I get a lot. And you also seem to dwell in awe throughout the book on photosynthesis, the creatures and captured and now performing these fundamental roles of wavelengths, from radio waves to the visible spectrum, even of the alphabet. I loved how you put awe at what life came up with and awe at its consequences. So just yesterday, I read a study on awe walks, suggesting that opening ourselves up to awe is actually good for our health, and that, elderly participants in this study, over time, when they experienced awe, when they went out deliberately trying to look for awe, they felt less pain and distress. And it's actually a mode of dealing with chronic pain. I'm curious what your perspectives on awe are in terms of that, the same things we talked about being uniquely human versus other species encountering. Do you feel like this is part of what makes us human? And in that sense, do you think that awe can save us from some of our worst impulses?
I think that awe is probably part of a package of emotions and responses and forms of thinking that might save us, as you say. I agree that the word awe is an appropriate word for my own experiences and my own responses to wild nature and the scenes in the book. As you were talking just now, I was thinking, yeah, I guess there's a kind of more obvious and less obvious side to that. The more obvious side is just the immediate encounter with remarkable animals, with remarkable landforms, with places and living things that are astounding. But there's also the less obvious or more reflective kind of awe that comes from thinking about, one of the things we just talked about, which is the transformative action of life in the context of the history of the Earth. And another is the unity of animal life, the tree of common ancestry that links all animals on Earth. The fact that if you look across to a dog or a cat, or to an ant or an octopus, even to non-animals, to an oak tree, to all living things, you can ask a question about the ancestry and the common ancestry that all those living things have. There'll be a living thing that is the great grandmother, lots of greats, of you and a bumblebee, for example. And there's a sense of unity and kinship that one can get from thinking along those lines. And also, I think, a sense of awe at the, at what the tree of animal life has produced. It's produced octopuses and bumblebees and elephants and cheetahs and strange little colorful slugs and, all the things it has. So yes, there's the obvious immediate kind of awe, and there's a more reflective kind when you think about the unity of life, the transformative role of life, and those sorts of themes.
Yeah. And I guess what I feel like is our world right now crowds that out a lot. And it's hard to make time for it unless you seek it deliberately. Do you, I don't know, do you find that? Do you find ways of seeking it that work for you, or do you try to help others find it?
I certainly think the crowding out is a real phenomenon. And, I think the main culprit that I would identify is the same one that most people identify, which is the profusion of electronically based information of all levels of quality just pouring in there. In my own case, trying to step away from that and into a simpler and richer kind of experience. Walking is the straightforward and remarkably effective. Walking in a forest, I find just, enormously rewarding. And the scuba diving that I've been neglecting a little bit
I was
this
gonna
year,
say,
but
yeah.
I'll come back to that very soon. The particular kind of encounter you have with with other animals, with this different side of the living world underwater. It stops you in your tracks, not literally in your tracks, I guess. It stops you in your fin kicks. And I do think of that as I think it's an important thing to seek, a getting away from the crowding out that you mentioned.
Yeah, the advantage of being underwater is you can't bring your phone. At least not yet.
Well, we'll see. I bet, and I have to say, I mean, when I dive, I'm always wanting to write things down. So I write things on pads. I've occasionally written single words into sand and taken a photo of the
Oh,
word because I'm
wow.
just dying to remember some phrase or some thought. And I
Yeah.
worry that when it does become possible to bring technology underwater, I'll be more technology underwater, I'll be unable to resist. And I
Yeah.
should probably resist for the
Yeah.
reasons that we're talking about.
Totally. Yeah, no, it's a really good reminder. Um, so another thing I found fascinating was your description of how our brain waves actually synchronize with each other's when we're performing cooperative tasks. Not just the same tasks, but even complementary tasks that are sort of
Yeah.
toward achieving a common goal. Um, and I wasn't clear whether, maybe you can tell me, whether people with compatible brainwaves are more likely to cooperate, or if cooperating makes our brainwaves align, or like where the cause and effect there is. I think maybe it's both, as you're always showing, action shapes perception and perception shapes action, and everything goes around in a circle. But it reminded me of how, so I learned when I was a new mother that if I slept in the same room as my baby, our breathing patterns would synchronize, and therefore
Mhm.
put my baby at lower risk of SIDS. And now I wonder if that's because our brain waves were actually synchronized. So I'm curious, but in terms of like understanding how to navigate these problems and work together to solve them, do you think understanding that offers any hope for bridging some of the divides that polarize our society right now?
Okay, there's a lot to think about in there. Let's start with the brainwaves thing. This is something I did come across while working on this book, and just a little bit on the previous book in the series, and I was just amazed by it. I think there's reasonably good evidence that in understanding human experience, the oscillatory rhythmic patterns that our brains produce at a kind of whole brain scale are not just byproducts, that they're important in forming human experience. That was a theme in the earlier book. And I came across just a couple of sentences in a well-known discussion of that phenomenon, just of the importance of brain oscillations in our minds, by Yuri Busharki, who's a very famous neuroscientist in this area. And he just said briefly in one of his books And by the way, if you're at a cocktail party and you're able to sort of pick someone's voice out of the noise and the clutter, and you feel a kind of connection with them that's one-to-one, your brainwaves are probably synchronizing. And I thought, really? I mean, is that really true? And I found out that this is something that's been studied a lot now. The name of the methodology is hyperscanning, scanning the brain waves of two people simultaneously, especially in cooperative and, as you say, sort of complementary social interactions. And there is good evidence that in lots of those situations, there is a partial, not complete, but a partial syncing of those oscillations where, to answer part of your question, the cause-effect arrow that is the one that's studied and a bit controversial and exciting is supposed to be from the fact that we're cooperating to a partial syncing of our brain waves, rather than we're in sync, so we start to be nice to each other, or something like that. I mean, it's interesting to ask about both directions of influence, but the thing that's the focus of study, the thing that's controversial and to me extremely surprising, is the apparent partial syncing of brain oscillations across people who are, especially when they're working together on something, if we're doing some task in a complementary way, it raises all kinds of questions. I mean, how this is possible at all is very controversial. There's been a couple of papers written by very informed people saying this sort of can't really be happening. It's almost physically impossible because the speed of the oscillations that can be apparently synced up is so fast. It could be on the level of 40 cycles a second and things like that. So there's controversy surrounding the whole thing, but I find it just extraordinarily exciting, this area of research. It has changed my experience of cocktail parties and all sorts of interactions now. I'm always curious about what people's brain oscillations are doing.
And imagine bringing them into the lab. Do you think it's like finding common ground? Is there a strategy for getting there through, like, does there seem to be any correlation with that? Not just the cooperation of the task, but the mode of thinking, the way that we might empathize or better understand each other?
I suspect that that's getting beyond what people have been able to study so far. I mean, because the kind of contact or common ground that you're talking about is very subtle. It has to do more than just with the fact that we're playing a cooperative game together or playing a duet on different instruments together. You're talking about something that is more having to do with a person's mental orientation to the person and to the situation and the task. Studying that would be very difficult,
Yeah.
I assume. This is early days, though. I mean, this area has it's been going for a while in a sort of a cautious form, but it's been taking off recently. And I wouldn't want to say that the things you're talking about will be forever unstudyable. It might just be too early to directly grapple with them now.
Yeah. No, but it did, just the idea of it made me feel a kinship, like you're saying, sort of changes your experience of the cocktail party or just of the conversations with strangers, that you're like, oh my gosh, we might be in sync right now. And actually, I feel like it's similar to the way that you sort of upended the idea of Umwelt in part of your discussion, that sensory bubble that makes each creature's perception and experience of the world unique, or at least the idea of it.
I hadn't made that connection between the two discussions, but you're quite right. There is a connection there. Sorry, did you want to finish?
No,
or...
I actually, I'd love to hear you talk about that, because I really did think that was interesting, the way you sort of took down that that theory, and at the root of that, taking it down, was ecology, the interactions, that like nothing is in isolation. So yeah, no, I'd love to hear your perspectives more on that.
Okay, sure. And I hadn't made the particular connection that you're making now, but I agree it's a genuine connection. the Umwelt concept introduced by Jakob von Uexküll about bit over 100 years ago or so now. This is the idea which for him was a kind of philosophically infused biological idea that we all live inside our own worlds of sensation or action, which he likened to soap bubbles. It's like we're all in our own soap bubble. The argument for this was that we have different senses, we perceive the world very differently. You know, color might be important to me, but irrelevant to another animal, and olfaction, smell might be dominating the sensory world of an animal, but irrelevant to another. He argued for a kind of self-containedness, well, from the perspectival nature of perception, he argued for a kind of self-containedness of the worlds that we inhabit and deal with. And as you say, I don't like the idea. I think I see the appeal, but it pushes away, I think, from a kind of ecological perspective, a perspective in which we're all here together. We're all here in the same world together. And there's a privacy in our perspectives, that's true. And different animals encounter the world differently. They pick up different things. They respond differently. But when they act into an arena that is a common arena. All our actions are kind of poured together into this common realm, and our actions have consequences in concert with the other actions of all the other living things around us. So that's the idea of the sort of ecological perspective that action brings us. But as you say, the idea that there are these surprising, hidden, coordinative connections between the brain activities of different people, and presumably also non-humans. There's a question here which I don't think has been looked at yet, perhaps at all, perhaps just not very much, about the non-human syncing of brain oscillations, because the rhythms we're talking about are not just a human thing. They're all over the place in animals. Anyway, but at least in the human case, right, at the cocktail party, there's an extra sense in which you're there in a common arena, because it's a situation in which there's this coordination being achieved or arrived at across the distance, across the two people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kinship, that reciprocity, you do touch on reciprocity a bit throughout between the human and the non-human, these relationships. They actually really made me think of how indigenous worldviews have more ecological strains of thought to them than a lot of Western philosophy, which is the basis for a lot of our philosophy, modern philosophy. And living there in Australia, I'm curious if you have explored Aboriginal philosophies or other indigenous philosophies, and what you think modern philosophy maybe has to learn from these.
To some extent, I have. I haven't done it as much as some people who are working on similar themes like that, partly because of awareness I have of cherry picking the sort of bits of indigenous worldviews that I like and thinking, okay, this bit helps me, but taking it profoundly out of context and not taking the whole seriously, where the whole might include a lot of features that I don't have the same positive attitude to. So there's a kind of cherry picking which I'm wary of. Now, if the thing I'm talking about as cherry picking is okay, then exactly as you say, there's a kind of ecological mindset. There's an awareness of connectedness. There's a refusal to see human action as something separate from the larger causal goings on in ecological systems. That I endorse and do resonate with. It doesn't play a big role in the discussion in Living on Earth. Right, also, partly because this is supposed to be a global book. It's not supposed to be a book with a particular with particular connections to the Australian situation.
Right, sure, but I do think you wind up in the same place as many other things that I've heard about value systems and worldviews, that I just thought that was really neat, that, you got there
Yeah.
from more of a scientific lens, and it was really complementary. It relates to the moral philosophy aspects, I think, that you introduced at the end, as we think about action, larger societal action, not individual action, but maybe both. And a moral philosophy or ethics for our human relationships with non-human nature. And so we have, this audience is largely conservationists and scientists. At WWF, we use many of the same facts that you do toward the end of the book. In fact, we have our Living Planet report coming out later this month, which describes and documents species population declines and points to many of the same drivers that you describe: habitat loss, overexploitation, climate change. But you've constructed a very tight ethical argument for why this must be stopped. And I think that we often appeal with logic, and ethics has a sort of different domain. And so I'm curious about philosophy as a strategy for changing minds, changing hearts and minds, really. Have you found that this convinces people who otherwise might not be?
That's something I think, yet to find out about, what kind of role philosophy can have in shifting opinions in this area. As you were talking, I was reminded, I've had a number of conversations with people who've been teaching this kind of thing for longer than I have. I mean, I've been teaching in other parts of philosophy, but the more ethically oriented, conservation oriented side, it is to some extent new to me. It's something that came out of, well, writing about it has come out of writing the other books in this series. I remember a couple of conversations I had with colleagues who said, look, what really changes minds, the abstract arguments are all well and good, but when people come into contact with wild nature, that's what leads to a gestalt switch, and they just start to see things differently. And this connects back to the earlier part of our conversation, the importance of walking and experiencing things in real time and close up, having actual immediate contact with what remains of wild nature. I hope, though, I mean, I'm pleased that you said it, that the argument seemed tight. I take that to be a positive feature for sure. I hope that this more theoretical side will do some good. I hope that thinking about human action as a kind of outgrowth of this larger history of the organic transformation of the earth, putting it in that context, I hope that might be motivating as well as yielding understanding.
Yeah, definitely. I really feel that, because I think often people look to that deep time as like nothing we do matters, and they sort of let themselves off the hook. And I think that you've made a really sound case for everything we do matters, and everything is a choice. So thank
Right.
you.
Thank you both so much for this thoughtful conversation. I kept on wanting to embed myself with follow-up questions as you were talking. And before we get to some audience questions, one that did pop into my head, we're obviously having this conversation via Zoom. We're not together. And so just, I guess, Peter, would love your thoughts on how our increasingly virtual world is going to impact our brain wave connections with one another to the natural world. Like, how is that impacting the way that we're working together to solve these big problems that we're facing?
Yeah, it's a big and good question. Firstly, on the scientific side, on the sort of syncing of brain waves during cooperative interactions and so on, one of the things that's really weird is that there are some papers suggesting that you don't have to be in the same room to get some of this coordination occurring across people.
That's good.
Yeah, but that it's more powerful when it's face to face, when you're really there with someone. I think I have the same kind of ambivalence more broadly about this that a lot of people have. I mean, it's wonderful to be able to sit here at midnight in the Blue Mountains and talk to people in the US and do so effortlessly, and exchange ideas in these ways. In academic life, though, I worry about the decline in face-to-face seminars, talks where someone's there as a sort of a full human body giving the talk and communicating in all the ways that in-person interaction can engender. So I have a kind of mixed view about that.
Yeah, I think we're all grappling with that, certainly, right? During the pandemic, a lot of us worked remote for a long time, right? Now, even in the discussion with return to office, I think we're all still determining what the future looks like in that way. But I agree, I definitely love being around people. Okay, so I think we have some time for a couple of audience questions. Thank you so much again to everyone who has been joining us for this. We have a question here in the chat. So Peter, in your book, you talk about support for the Gaia hypothesis that the Earth acts like an organism regulating itself to remain hospitable to life. What is your stance on that? And are humans, with climate change and speeding up processes, are we impacting the Earth's ability to regenerate?
I'm a skeptic about Gaia in the kind of classic, strong, adventurous form where the Earth itself is said to be an organism. That was what Lovelock and Margulis originally wanted to argue for, a kind of grand regulation of the planet, which included the cooperative activities of all sorts of living things and also inorganic structures. I'm skeptical about that. But one of the pleasures of writing this book was interacting a bit with Tim Lenton, who's a British scientist who's probably the leading living defender of the Gaia idea in a somewhat moderated, less adventurous way. And Lenton just insists that, he said, look, you can deny the Earth is an organism, fine, and I'm not going to push that case. But there's a lot of surprising life-friendly regulation going on. And that has to be recognized, has to be put into some kind of theoretical context. So in the second chapter, once I've sort of argued against the stronger original Gaia ideas, the Earth is an organism, there's a certain amount of back and forth and a certain amount of caution about ideas like Lenton's, where he's saying, no, there is something surprising here. There's something that the mainstream tends to miss. And I have to accept the empirical arguments that there are some surprising things going on. I'm very curious what Becky thinks about those more recent forms of the Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah, I've often thought of it more as a metaphor than a reality.
Okay.
That it's I think that things act like other things, systems of, organ systems and, rivers as the lifeblood. And, there's all these component parts that do seem to add up more than the sum of them. So I share Tim's, maybe that's another source of awe for me, that everything just magically happens to work so well. And then when we disrupt it, that we're throwing things out of balance, out of homeostasis, out of that, we are sort of causing organ failure. But I guess I do think of it more as like a convenient metaphor than an actual scientific phenomenon.
Right. I'm wary of it as a metaphor because in a way, at least in some versions, the metaphorical view could push against deliberate, reflective action, the kind of thing that WWF is all about. A person could say, well, the Earth will take care of things. It'll know what to do. When someone says that as a sort of metaphorical version of Gaia,
yeah.
I want to say, right,
letting yourself off the hook. Yeah.
That's letting us off the hook.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and I think also your point about people always say that rainforests are the lungs of the planet, and you're like, actually, like, there's plenty of oxygen. That's not what we're really so concerned with. It's this tiny amount of carbon dioxide gas that's really throwing us off. So sometimes getting the details right is really important to in action, and that the convenient, beautiful things to say aren't always the changes we need to make.
Right.
I guess then, speaking of changes, for our final question, Peter, you have in one of the final sections of the book just an argument about how we do need to address both climate change, but then also the loss of nature. And WWF focuses a lot on that as well, right? How we can stop the loss of biodiversity. And so I guess the question to both of you is, what is the right path forward for this? You know, Becky, in relation to us releasing the Living Planet report, there'll be some, you know, really just depressing statistics on the declines of species populations. What are the solutions in that way? Is it the approach of reversing climate change and stopping the loss of biodiversity? Like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, can I go first to give Peter the final word? Because I think
Please.
he'll have a more existential response to that. But I think the specific solutions are pretty clear. We know what we need to do. It's more of a question of how to do it. So on, you know, nature conservation, for instance, we need it to be more expansive, more mainstream, more effective, but really actually fundamentally more just, more inclusive, in order for it to be more durable. So it should occupy a larger part of everyone's lives, and everyone should feel included in it. But then that can't happen if we're not also addressing the main drivers of change. So food systems, energy systems. Again, we know what we need to change about them. That, you know, it's been clear for a while. The science has been clear about how we could transition to renewable energy, how we need to move toward more regenerative food systems that can continue to feed the planet and, you know, not just erode you know, all of the resources we have in the name of feeding people right now. And so I think it's, for me, that those pathways are so clear that it's almost I'm almost just befuddled at how we haven't chosen them yet. And since Peter talks so much about choice, I'm wondering if you can leave us with something, you know, hopeful or that, you know, we can grab onto about how do we make these choices when the choices are clear, when the consequences are clear. How do we choose maybe the longer term thing, the harder thing, that is the right thing?
Okay, just a couple of comments on a few elements here. A part of the book that I imagine might be controversial, but perhaps less so in a kind of WWF setting, is my claim that we tend to lose sight of environmental problems other than climate change in the current context of intense ongoing discussion of climate change, especially within progressive political contexts. So one thing I wanted to do is kind of rebalance things a little bit and argue for putting a bit more weight on habitat preservation, rewilding, the prevention of species loss, the prevention of just the sheer loss of numbers in wild species. I think of that as tied to climate change, certainly, but it's not just one problem. It's a partially separable problem, and I think I would like to see a reweighting, a partial reweighting in which more specific attention was put on those species losses, habitat losses, loss of tropical forests, just for the importance of those places themselves, not just as how they relate to questions about climate change. I think of this as something that WWF recognizes. So this is the kind of context where I think, okay, this won't be as controversial perhaps in this setting as it might be in some other conversational settings. Now, on the question of the future, I am optimistic. I'm not pessimistic about these questions. And I don't know to what extent that's temperamental and to what extent it is a consequence of a point of view where we look at human choice, human intelligence, human action as this peculiar evolutionary outgrowth on the tree of life, one that's led to this one odd species being able to look over the whole, survey the whole, understand to some extent the history of animals, how ecologies work, the place that we and others have within the entire system. And, it's possible to say, well, and we've got no chance of it fixing any of this, but I don't see reason to believe that. I think the track record in human history includes all sorts of disastrous actions and disastrous decisions, but it also includes a kind of profound adaptability and the ability to reflect, think again, discuss these things, try to reach consensus. I'm not pessimistic about the powers of that aspect of human life.
Well, good. I hope we can, I hope we can get there together.
Agreed. I share in your optimism. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time, Becky, for getting up early in California, and Peter for staying up very late in Australia. This has been such a thought-provoking conversation, and I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to go out and get your copy of Living on Earth. If you, again, had folks who weren't able to join this conversation, this will be posted to YouTube in the coming days. And happy reading, everybody. We'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much, Peter.
All right, take care. Bye.